I'm a single man in my early 30s. I've got a brother who's 29, and he's already got 4 kids. He had his first at 22, the second followed a year later, the third came 2 years after that, and the fourth was born just a couple of months ago. His wife and I do not get along. She always likes to try and get a rise out of me by acting superior, then turns into an extreme, self-victimizing drama queen if I retaliate in any way. She can cry in an instant and put on an extremely convincing show to get sympathy from just about anyone. My parents and brother absolutely adore her, even though they know exactly how she really is and just don't care. She's very good looking, I'll give her that, but she's so awful that I could never be attracted to her. She also refuses to get any sort of job, even though she has a college degree, and my mother willingly helps with the kids all day. So, their finances are entirely dependent on my brother. This also means they can't afford to live anywhere but my parents' house. Privacy is a bit of an issue, with all of them under one roof in a 3-bedroom house that was built in the 60s. Growing up, my younger brother was the obvious favorite. We're 3 years apart in age, but he developed a superiority complex because I was badly punished if I ever retaliated against his antics. Back then, it was obvious my parents cared for him a lot more because he got the lion's share of everything, and less people called them out on it, which did happen quite a bit, especially from other family members. This led my parents to pack us all up and move us about 150 miles away, so they only saw us on holidays, as it was a 3-hour drive. My brother became physically abusive toward me on several occasions. He flirted relentlessly with my first girlfriend to the point she broke up with me, and laughed at any misfortune I had. My parents just told me to suck it up whenever I was upset about it. I only got equal treatment when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. I admit, it was rather funny to see the looks on their faces whenever they had to treat me equally to my brother on birthdays and Christmas because other people were present. We had relatives who were very nosy and loved gossiping about drama, so my parents did their best to hide what was really going on. They even threatened to take all my stuff away if I didn't keep my mouth shut. If anything, it just made my parents celebrate more when I turned 18 and moved out because it meant they no longer had to provide for me. I wasn't even done with high school when I moved out, but couch surfing was far better than living with them. I had low contact with them ever since. They didn't even show up for my high school graduation, but I didn't care. From that point on, I would usually only see my parents and brother on holidays, like the rest of the family. The start of the 2020 pandemic was not kind to me. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job. Neither of us could afford the place on unemployment money. It was a rented 2-bedroom condo that I really loved, and as the lease was ending, my roommate left early to move back in with relatives. I had to sell nearly all of my stuff because I was soon going to be homeless if I didn't downsize drastically. I really shouldn't have rented a place that was so expensive, but I liked living the high life until that life wasn't kind to me. I realized I should have been living somewhere much cheaper, so I could have saved more money to fall back on. I had a plan. I own a truck, simply for the fact that I've always loved trucks. So, I found a $1,000 camper in good shape and put it on my truck, just so I could live out of it for a while. It was supposed to be temporary, but I ended up living in it far longer than I ever thought. I originally hoped to park it at my parents' house, where my brother and his family still lived, but when I asked them to let me stay for a while, they told me they had a full house and didn't want me there. Plus, we hadn't exactly gotten along in the past decade. They said they'd only agree to let me park my camper there if I paid them basically what it would cost to rent an apartment in my area. That was way too much just to park a camper. I was jobless and trying to save as much of my unemployment money as I could until I could find a new job. I might as well have been living in an apartment with that rent price they were asking. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to take a hike since we couldn't come to an agreement. They thought it was absolutely hilarious that I had to live in a camper. My brother joined in, mocking me and calling me a homeless bum. So, I parked my truck camper in a store parking lot to sleep on the first night. I had nowhere else to go. I felt scared out of my mind that someone might try to break in. Suffice to say, I didn't sleep well that night. There was nowhere else I could go. Other relatives with houses were too far away, and all my friends lived in apartments. I was pretty attached to my area, so I didn't want to just leave. I had my mail forwarded to a friend's apartment, as that was the only way I could still get it. Finding a stable place to park was difficult. I spent months living the nomadic camper life. In that time, I had to deal with a lot, from beggars and drug addicts to people demanding I leave because my camper was an eyesore. At one point, someone who told me to move claimed to be with an HOA, even though I wasn't parked on a street with houses. When I questioned what HOA they were with, they got belligerent and threatened me. I moved my camper anyway just to avoid trouble. To have a steady supply of electricity, I learned to use a long extension cord to plug in anywhere I could to recharge my camper batteries. This meant sneaking around and plugging it into an outside outlet of a random building while parked on a street. I know that's a crummy thing to do, but I had to keep my batteries charged so my refrigerator would stay cold. I had a small solar power bank for recharging my phone, but I didn't have anything like a generator. Plus, generators are noisy and require fuel. After months of living like that, I finally managed to get a new job. I had to move to the neighboring city to find work that didn't involve retail. I had worked retail while in college and promised myself I would never do it again, though I was almost ready to break that promise. I was still getting unemployment money, but I had no stable place to live while receiving it, and I didn't want to be jobless when it ran out. Plus, I was bored out of my mind with little else to do except read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, and keep track of where I could park and which local public bathrooms I could use. My parents told Dan they were leaving, then my mother said I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I wouldn't change my mind, and that she shouldn't come back. Then I told Sill that my phone had recorded everything, and if she tried anything, I'd call the authorities. She screamed at me and stormed out, crying with her face in her hands. My mother was the last one out the door and told me I'd better do this for Dan and Sill. I responded firmly, telling her I wouldn't be part of their plan. After I kicked my parents, brother, and Sill out for trying to force me to give my house to my brother, I went straight to social media. I posted about the whole situation because I knew that the moment they got home, they'd try to spin the story to make me look like the bad guy. And I was right. But I had about an hour to get my side out, and I had video evidence to back up what they'd done. Being proactive worked. Several family members reached out to support me, but most importantly, I had the truth on my side. It didn't take long for the story to spread, but once I made my profile private, it all got deleted. My parents, Dan, and Sill must have been planning to write their own post, but by the time they thought about it, it was too late. So they didn't bother trying to lie much. They had a few people who sided with them, but overall, the truth was clear. There was one person in particular who called me, someone I didn't know, ranting at me that I was a horrible brother and I needed to make way for a real family man. I just ended the call and blocked the number. That was the only time that week I heard anything like that. Later that week, my parents showed up with Dan just like they said they would. They rang my doorbell like crazy and pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened the door just a crack, but they tried to force their way in again. I'd installed latch chains, so the door wouldn't open any further, and I braced myself against it for good measure. My father and brother demanded I let them in, but I said I was recording everything and would call the police if they tried to break in again. My mother calmed them down and then, in a sickly sweet tone, asked if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them to leave and never come back. My mother pretended to cry, asking why I couldn't just do this for Dan, because he's my beloved brother. I told her I didn't love him as a brother because he had treated me terribly for years, and they had always encouraged it. They were terrible parents, and he was a terrible brother. I told them to leave before I called the police. They left surprisingly easily, though my mother cried loudly, and the others shot me dirty looks. I thought the whole mess was over, but I guess I underestimated them, because they had other plans. On Friday evening, I came home to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in my driveway. Dan and his family were moving in. When I saw him, I was furious. He just waved at me with a smug grin. I told him and the rest of his family to stop, but he smugly said that whether I liked it or not, they were moving in. Then, in a fake, sweet voice, Sill said it was okay because Mommy allowed it and I should always listen to what my mommy says. I was seething. I locked myself in my truck to call the police. When they realized what I was doing, Sill started pounding on my window, yelling at me to stop and claiming that they needed the house. She even cried, asking why I couldn't just do this for Dan. I told her, it's my house, not his. She threatened to damage my truck unless I stopped calling the police. All of this was captured on the 911 call, thanks to the window being slightly open. I told her if she damaged my truck, I'd sue her. Fortunately, she retreated when the police arrived. Dan and Sill had locked themselves inside my house. I told the officers what had happened and showed them my new driver's license, which had my current address. When we reached my front door, I saw that they had changed the lock. The old one was on the porch with a drill beside it. Clearly, they had used it to break in. I gave the police a rundown of all the events that had led to this point. At some point, my parents must have called them because they showed up while I was speaking with the cops. They immediately started lying, saying I had agreed to rent my house to my brother. I told them that was an easily provable lie. Then, Dan and Sill came out of the house looking smug, holding what appeared to be a fake rental agreement. The signature was obviously forged. It didn't even resemble mine. I pointed that out to the police and told them it was fraud. I warned my parents and Dan that if the cops investigated, they'd easily figure it out, and they could end up in serious trouble. I also said that if anything of mine was damaged, stolen, or broken, I would sue for damages and even call Child Protective Services for good measure. Dan went pale when I said that. But my mother got between us and insisted that I should just do this for Dan and live in the camper so they could have a family home. I yelled at her and told her if she thought that was such a good idea, she could let Dan stay in her house. The cops stepped in to separate us, and I made it clear that if they didn't leave, I'd press charges. I told them the lock was damaged, the lease was a forgery, and that I had video evidence of Sill attacking me. Those were felonies. If they didn't leave now, I'd make sure they paid for it. My parents finally realized they couldn't force me to do anything. My mother gave up and went over to talk quietly with Sill. I'm sure she told her to back down, because Sill started loudly crying and ripping up the fake lease. The officer told her to clean up the paper bits or she'd be fined for littering. By then, the cops were looking pretty done with the whole situation. Dan started telling his kids to load up the moving truck, but the eldest was crying because he wouldn't have his own room anymore. Still, Dan and Sill all tried to guilt-trip me with their sad family routine, and I refused to back down. They tried everything, but I wasn't going to let them manipulate me into giving up my home. Dan yelled at me, accusing me of being selfish and denying them a place to live. I just laughed and told him that what he was trying to do wasn't sharing, it was taking. No amount of crying would change that. The cops stayed to make sure they left, and eventually my parents, Dan and Sill, packed up and left. Before they left, I gave my parents one last piece of my mind, calling them out for everything they had put me through growing up. The cops stood there silently, clearly not paid enough to deal with this kind of family drama. I reminded them how they had always treated me badly, from not helping me when I was struggling to survive, to letting Dan ridicule me. And now, they were trying to take my house from me for Dan, their favorite child, while I had worked hard to buy it on my own. My mother started crying, and my father looked like he wanted to hit me, but he just stood there. Dan avoided eye contact and stayed with his kids. Sill was having another tantrum, throwing things around in the yard. Eventually, they all left without saying a word. I got back online and shared the whole story, and this time, my family couldn't twist the narrative. Most of them sided with me. Those who didn't just stayed silent. No matter how much my parents previously tried the "we did it for Dan" line, no one was buying it anymore. Any remaining support they had from family members disappeared. Many who I expected to side with me did, including some of the people who used to defend my brother and his wife. I guess they'd finally had enough. Around that time, I offered to host half the family for Christmas Eve at my new house, but my parents weren't invited. To my surprise, I wasn't blocked on my brother and Sill's profiles, and I saw that Sill had her fourth baby in early November. They were still living with my parents, and I'm pretty sure they knew I was watching because Sill kept posting passive-aggressive updates about how she didn't have enough space living with them. I can't say I'm surprised. I'm sure it's driving my parents crazy because they're dealing with 3 rowdy kids, a newborn, a mentally unstable Sill, and my brother, all under one roof. Maybe they should move into a camper in their own backyard and let Dan have the house completely. They might get some peace that way. But hey, they could always do that for Dan if they want. For those who kept saying I should have had my brother and Sill arrested, the reason I didn't was simple. They have kids who depend on them. If Dan was arrested, he'd likely lose his job, and without that, his family has no financial support. Sill also had a newborn baby. Neither of them needed to end up in jail. But revenge doesn't always need police intervention. I decided to wait before making a post about everything. I wanted to be sure that no more drama would unfold, and sure enough, it didn't take long for things to kick up again. Sill kept posting the same tired complaints on social media, always about how she didn't have enough space, that she needed her own house, blah blah blah. To be honest, it got so repetitive that it was hard not to roll my eyes. Life with these people has been rough, so I was feeling pretty cynical about their endless whining. By January, things had calmed down a bit, and I felt ready to share my side of the story. I had invited half the family over for Christmas Eve at my house, and despite the long drive, everyone showed up to support me. They praised me for how hard I worked to get my house on my own, and they apologized for everything I'd been through. One of my relatives asked why I didn't just take my camper and drive back to them, instead of living pretty much homeless for so long. I had to sheepishly admit that I was really attached to the area. The job opportunities here are better for me, and I wanted to make it on my own. They understood, and we had a great time. The party was going smoothly until about 2 hours in, when my parents, brother, and Sill showed up uninvited. They didn't even knock, they just walked in like they belonged there. I immediately told them to leave. They begged to stay, claiming they'd brought gifts, but one of my uncles, who used to be very close with my mother, stood up and told them they weren't welcome after everything they'd done. It turned into a bit of a family intervention. My grandparents, despite their age, also voiced their disappointment, saying they'd hidden their favoritism towards Dan for too long. It was clear to everyone now, and if my parents ever wanted to be part of my life again, they'd need to make a serious effort to treat me like a son. Sill, of course, started crying, demanding she should be the one living in my house. She plopped herself in a chair and started throwing a tantrum. She claimed it wasn't fair that I had a house to myself, while she had 4 kids who needed more space. I couldn't hold back and sarcastically pointed out that she wasn't doing much parenting herself, considering my mother had to step in and do most of it for her. The room went quiet, and Sill demanded to know if I was calling her a bad mom. I just told her the truth. If she wanted to be able to afford her own place, she needed to stop spending all of Dan's money and start using her college degree to find a job. At that point, her son, who's 7, ran up and started kicking and screaming at me, blaming me for making his mom cry. My brother grabbed him and tried to calm him down, but it was clear that the rest of the family was fed up. It became a full-blown intervention, with relatives telling my brother and Sill to grow up and take responsibility. Sill and Dan were a mess by the end. Sill was crying, Dan looked defeated, and my parents were realizing that their reputations within the family were ruined. For once, the whole family saw through their act. Eventually, they left, and the party resumed. We didn't speak about what had just happened for the rest of the night. Everyone had a good time, and after all the chaos, I felt like I could finally relax. Christmas morning, I was up early brewing coffee and making sure everyone had what they needed. I was told I was a much better host than my parents ever were, which made me smile. After that night, Sill finally stopped posting passive-aggressive updates, at least for a while. She deleted all of the previous ones, but shortly after the new year, she posted about how she tried to convince my parents to set up a camper in their backyard so that Dan's family could take over their house. The post was up for only a couple of days before it disappeared, but not before I saw it. It was clear to me that Sill was still trying to push for what she wanted, even if she knew my parents weren't going to allow it. But after all that drama, things started to calm down. I've been spending time with friends, having poker nights. I'm terrible at poker, but it's fun, and just enjoying my space. My camper sits idle in the yard now, a reminder of how far I've come. Maybe one day, I'll actually get to use it for camping like it was meant to be. After all, it's the one thing I've truly earned on my own, and I intend to keep it that way. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit notification bell to stay updated.